We're live on air already, so we can just get right into it, man.
All right,
Can you
perfect.
introduce yourself real quick to the people?
Absolutely. So my name is Cyrus Jansen. I'm an American that has lived abroad for many years, and have run a geopolitical channel on YouTube. Just my name, Cyrus Jansen. Talk all things geopolitics. Heavy focus on China since I lived there for over 10 years. And yeah, just trying to dissect all of the crazy geopolitical stories we got going on in the world every day.
Nice. So you and I watched your channel quite a bit, man. I'm glad to have you on the show because I kind of want to let people understand that, like, China's advancing at an alarming rate. They're quickly becoming a very strong superpower. They're catching up. I think we're in a multipolar world now.
Yeah.
The days of us being the unipolar power, after the Soviet Union collapse in the early 90s and Desert Storm, etc. I think those days are kind of behind us here, and I think the Iran war is kind of showing that. I guess what we could do first is we could kind of talk about China as a whole, and then we could kind of
Sure.
segue into their involvement with the conflict and how they're
Sure.
involved in the conflict and stuff like that. But go ahead, take it away.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to discuss China. I mean, it's a country that I first visited in 2007. Had the pleasure of working there for over 10 years. Still do a lot of business in China. Travel back multiple times a year. My family and I would go back every summer. So we go to the southern city of Guangzhou, spend the summers there with the wife and kids. And yeah, I mean, it's a country that's often misunderstood in Western media, often understood by I think many Americans and many Westerners in general. But I think the perception of China is changing. It's changed a lot in the last 18 months with the rise of social media. A lot of content creators going to China. One of the best things that China's government's ever done is about 18 months ago, they started opening up the country, visa-free access to a ton of people. So if you're from the United Kingdom, for example, Canada is now visa-free. United
Is
States,
it visa free for us too?
visa-free, you can get a 10-day transit visa. So
Okay.
basically, if you, let's say you arrive in Beijing, you have to fly out of a different city. But yeah, you can basically get a 240-hour visa. So that's 10 days, you can be in China without a visa. You basically land there, get a transit visa, fly out of another city. So it's becoming much more accessible, to a lot of people. And actually, interesting fun fact, China is on track to become the #1 tourism economy in 2026. You have a tremendous amount of international visitors going there now. And kind of interesting because, the United States is hosting the FIFA World Cup this year, biggest sporting event in the world. But yet, a lot of people aren't coming for that. And, FIFA is already canceling hotel rooms because the need for hotels is not as much as they expected it would be. So kind of an interesting thing. Again, widely misunderstood, and happy to answer any questions you got or, anything you want to talk specifically about China.
Yeah. So you mentioned that tourism is going up. It's interesting because I know, I'm sure you're familiar with the streamer Speed. He went
Yeah.
ahead and did a stream in China. And,
did.
I think that stream really red pilled a lot of people on China, and they didn't realize, they see what they see in the news and in Western media. And it's like, oh yeah, China. Nothing works. People are starving. They're very poor. All this propaganda to make it look like they're not, keeping up with the United States and our economic power and our military power. But it's quite the contrary. Can you kind of take us through debunking some of the biggest myths when it comes to China?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of the ones that you said there, that Chinese people are, they're poor, that maybe the country's not as advanced, we tend to have an image of China still remarkably, even here in 2026, we have an image of China that's like stuck in the 1970s or 80s. We think of Chinese people wearing the Chairman Mao suits, driving bicycles around. It's a very agrarian society. There's, a lot of poverty. It's a third world country. It's not advanced. It's not developed. It couldn't be farther from the truth. You go to any of these major cities, you're seeing some of the best infrastructure that you'll find on the planet, whether it's the railway stations, the subway stations, the airports, incredible. But what's also really awesome is, a lot of tourists go to the big ones, Shanghai, Beijing, they go to Xi'an to go see the Terracotta Warriors. What's actually a better story is when you go to the second, third, fourth tier cities and you start to see how much those have improved as well. So some of these cities, that you've never heard of, but, they have remarkable subway systems. They have incredible high-speed rails. The cities are extremely clean. I've been able to witness firsthand a huge transformation in China. I mean, I was on the ground in 2007 when pollution was absolutely rampant. I'm talking pollution levels where, you could be at a red light and not be able to see if it was red or green because the pollution was that thick. It was crazy. And it was, this was the early days of China, 2007, 8, 9. But, things started to happen. 2008, Beijing hosted the Olympics, very successful Summer Olympics. 2010, Shanghai hosted the World Expo, which is like the World's Fair, a huge event for Shanghai. They really transformed the city for that event. And you just started to see China make a lot of structural changes. And, now they're really leading in a lot of, key technologies for the future. There's a really great report by ASPI. ASPI is the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Interesting enough, that institute is funded by the Department of State. So to say that it would be like a China ally it's certainly not. It's funded by the U.S. government. It generally has a very anti-China rhetoric, in a lot of its reports. But they came out and they said, okay, there's 64 critical technologies that are going to determine the future of our world. You can just Google this, just put in ASPI, like 64 critical technologies. You can find this report very easily. But basically, China leads in 57 of the 64. And in remarkable, let's say half of those, they have like an insurmountable lead, like an unbelievable lead in this. Even when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we're looking at the research that's being done, the amount of published studies that are being done. China leads all of this. So they have, the world's largest amount of STEM graduates at science, technology, engineering, mathematics. So there's just so much more nuance that needs to be discovered there. And when you go there, you have a very advanced life. You basically everything is run through your phone. There's a mega app called WeChat. You've probably heard of it.
Yeah.
But essentially, think of like your Uber app, your banking app, your social media. Your entire lifeline is built through one app. So you can pay your electrical bills, you can order a taxi, you can book your flights, you can invest, you can connect with your friends, you can share social media posts. Everything's done through WeChat, and it's super fast, super efficient. China's basically a cashless society. Everything is with this digital payment system. Everything is super fast, super convenient, and even things like delivery. You can get things delivered within hours. So it's like Amazon Prime on steroids. As far as how fast China is and how efficient. So yeah, there's just a lot more nuance, and I think what's great, like I mentioned earlier, with so many tourists pouring into China right now, there's a lot of people. This is trending all over social media. There's a big trend right now on Instagram and TikTok where people are saying, I'm China maxing. I'm entering a very Chinese stage of my life. They're starting to drink warm beverages. They're Chinese, for example, they don't drink like cold water. They don't drink ice water. Everything is room temperature because it's better for your body. So people
really?
are starting to,
Okay.
yeah. So people are there's a trend on Instagram right now. Like I'm entering a Chinese phase of my life where I'm drinking tea a lot more. I'm, doing yoga. I'm going for walks. I'm, just connecting with nature and, trying to live this like Chinese style life. So it's been kind of interesting to see, how, the global perception of China is changing. And, at the same time, the United States under Donald Trump, our image is certainly not advancing, over the last, 12 to 15 months. Polls across the world show that very clearly that, the United, we kind of live in a bubble here in America where the vast majority of Americans don't travel, they don't own passports. So, we tend to just be in America. We don't really care what other people think about our country.
Yep.
But, for example, I'm also a Canadian citizen. I lived in Canada for many years. My wife, my kids were all dual citizens. And, I could tell you very clearly, a lot of Canadians are not happy with the United States right now.
Yeah.
Definitely not happy with Donald Trump. And, there's never been a more patriotic time for Canadians to really embrace their roots because, when Donald Trump says, hey, you guys are the 51st state, we're going to take you over. That is
Canada lives because of the United States. And, obviously that carrying you off. I know he just struck a deal with China recently too. A strategic energy deal not too long ago.
100%.
So,
yeah.
Okay. So real quick, because I got a lot of questions there. So WeChat, you mentioned that. What about the fear of social credit scores? I saw a video where, they said there are a bunch of people, Chinese people are out on the streets, living on the streets, homeless because they have a low social credit score. Is that true?
Yeah.
Is it not true? What's the deal with that?
Myron, I got to be honest, that social credit system, it is by far the most effective propaganda I've ever heard from the United States government because, basically I would challenge anybody to ask any single Chinese person, what about the social credit system? They're going to look at you and say, what are you talking about? We have no idea what you're talking about. This has been completely fabricated. There's absolutely no truth to that. And it's honestly, it's just hilarious, to just see, one, it's just how effective it is because that is like the number one question I get from people. Well, China has this social credit system where, if you don't have a good credit score, like you can't ride a bus, you can't rent an apartment, you basically are shunned from society. And it's like, yeah, it literally doesn't exist. It's not like the system's there and people are trying to like cover it up. It doesn't exist. It's like a complete fabrication, but it is such an effective propaganda and brainwashing because it is by far the number one question that I get. And it's kind of what most people hear, and they just, and so again, we always kind of look at China as like, they're so good at propaganda. I gotta be honest, China's not good at propaganda. They're terrible at it. Their propaganda is just so like, blatant, whereas the United States, like no one does propaganda like the US government. Like we are
We do
masters
it
of the
pretty good.
craft. We do it good. We do it really good.
Yeah.
And I mean, honestly, the most propagandized people in the world are Americans, because our government says all these things, and it's just half of it's
And most
untrue.
people don't travel. And like you said before, most American, I'll be more blunt about it than you. I say most Americans are. And the reason why is because they don't travel, they don't go see other countries. A lot of them don't have a passport. They watch Fox News. They believe everything that they see on Fox News. And the whole ideology or concept that like, hey, look, maybe we need to, do a little bit of diplomacy, or maybe we don't run the world or as much as we think we are, or like, we're in a multipolar world. They'll scoff at that and be like, no way, you don't know, no way,
Yeah, and I mean, and you talk about the multipolar world. I mean, America is strongest when we have great relations with our allies. I mean, who doesn't want to be an ally of the United States? I mean, and this is, for example, all of Europe looks to the United States as the effective leader of the world. They want to make sure that they have good relations with the United States. But honestly, so many European countries are fed up right now with America. They're not happy with the United States, the leadership from Donald Trump. And, they've been very vocal about this. And we've seen this, there's an interesting poll from Politico that came out, and they asked residents of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Canada is the fourth one. They basically asked them a simple question, who do you think is a better partner to rely on in the future, China or the United States under Donald Trump? And all four countries, they all now have said that you have more people actually saying it's better to rely on China for our future than it is the United States under Trump. And so again, a lot of Americans, I tell that to people and they're like, who cares? I don't care what Canadians think. I don't care what British think. I don't care what the French think. Who cares about these people? Well, you know what? Honestly, it's good to have friends. It's good to have allies. And, I think, we've had an amazing relationship with Canada. You can't ask for, a better neighbor than Canada. Obviously, they've been a reliable partner. And again, this is a very personal issue for me since I'm a dual citizen. Now I lived in Vancouver for 5 years. There's the border between Vancouver and the United States. There's a peace arch, symbolizing the friendship between the United States and Canada. And it says, we are separated by a border, but we are brothers. And, let us always remember this amazing relationship that we have. We're two countries, united, and, our friendship should last forever. Something along those lines. It's not a direct quote, but it's, about like that. And then to hear the president just say, we don't even have a border, right? There's some imaginary line drawn. There's no real border between the United States and Canada. Yeah, there is. It's an international border. We have passports. We have different countries. Like it's a sovereign nation. You just can't be spouting stuff like this. It just makes you sound completely ridiculous. And again, Canadians love America. Canadians follow U.S. politics. They watch TV shows. They, all the sports teams. All Canadians have a great, passion for the United States. But all of a sudden, you disrespect us and you say, whoa, we're not a country. We're not sovereign. We're basically Americans. No, we're not Americans. We're Canadians. Again, we love you guys, but got to know your boundaries. And at the end of the day, we are still Canadian. So it's little things like that where, again, a lot of people might think big deal. It is actually a big deal because, you want to have those close allies, around the world. And that's unfortunately something that's, changing, very quickly over the last 15 months.
So I'll ask another myth. What about the empty cities? The empty cities. What is the deal with that? Apparently they said that they built all these empty cities. No one lives in them. All empty apartments. What's the deal with that?
Yeah. There's a really good YouTube video I would suggest people to watch. And it's by the YouTube channel Yes Theory, and very big channel. I think 11, 12 million subscribers, something like that.
Yes,
but
basically, Yes Theory, one word?
Yeah, I think so. It might be. But yeah, just type in Yes Theory. They basically went to the city that was built after Paris. So they basically recreated this Parisian city. They have an Eiffel Tower. They have French style buildings. They built this mega city there, and it basically modeled it exactly like Paris, France. So it's like a carbon copy. You have it looks exactly like that. And so these guys went there, and it's completely dead, right? It's dead. There's nothing around. It's like, man, this is really like weird. It's so weird. And then all of a sudden they realize, they're shooting it at like a Tuesday at 12 o'clock noon. So, not very busy there. But then as the day got longer and longer, more and more people started to come out, and they started to see, children playing in the streets, and they realized, they're like, wow, like look at all these kids around, like, like where are your parents at? And they're like, oh, like we're just out here playing. That's what we do in China, right? We don't have to worry about safety. It's a very safe country. And so all of a sudden they, if you watch that video, they kind of come to an end, and they're like, we kind of came here hearing this thing that there's these ghost cities and that everything's falling apart. We actually found like, China's amazing, and like this actual city is, actually, obviously we came at like a Tuesday Tuesday at 12 noon. No, it's not going to be that busy because people are working, they're doing things, but all of a sudden at nighttime, it starts to fill up. A lot of times what China does as well is, they build cities for the future, and so they're going to build, it's almost like the Field of Dreams, that movie where they, build it and they will come, where the guy in the movie, he builds a baseball field and everyone's like, dude, why are you building this random baseball field in Iowa of all places? And so he builds this baseball field and then all of a sudden everybody comes to play baseball and, you have to build it first. And so, that was a similar thing in China is where they started building these mega cities and eventually they start filling up. And, I'm not going to say that there's not like every single project is successful. I'm sure there's, still some projects that maybe didn't sell out as much, but it's nowhere near, what Western media is telling you. And again, one of the things that China does better than probably arguably any other country is really planning for that future. So, if we're going to build these cities, because, usually what they'll do is they'll tie it into an economic reason. For example, we're going to develop this new part of a city. We're going to build all these apartments. And because we're going to start building factories there, we're going to start building, different industries in this area. And obviously, if these new factories come, we're going to have places for people to live. And we're basically going to create this new city. And so, yeah, it's again, a little bit of nuance is needed to understand exactly how that works.
Okay. I want to talk about a little bit about the energy. China with renewable energy, electric cars, and rare earth metals. I guess we could hit renewable energy first. I know they're number one in the world right now, if I'm not mistaken, for solar panels. Can we talk about that a little bit and their renewable energy mode? I'm sure they're probably a little bit more motivated to do it now with the Strait of Hormuz being closed as well.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I made a video on my YouTube channel talking about like, is China the biggest winner of the Iran war? And it was an interesting thing because, I want to kind of bring it back to AI first because, we always often hear AI, right? The future of AI, it's the United States versus China. And this is an interesting one because, both countries have incredible engineers, scientists, both countries are absolutely leading, in AI, right? If you're looking at AI, it's the United States and China. There's not really any other countries that are as dominant as these two. So that it's really kind of like a two-man race, if you will. But no matter how many great engineers you have, no matter how many great systems you can build, it comes down to the data centers, right? It comes down to, AI needs a tremendous amount of electricity. And this is where China has a strategic advantage for the future. So there's a really famous graph, if you look at energy, production over the last 25 years, you look at the United States, it's relatively flat. Our energy grid in the United States has remained completely flat for 25 years. We've had essentially no growth at all. But China, because 25 years ago, it started investing in renewable energy. It started, again, it dominates solar panels. If you do some research on this, actually, back around the turn of the century, the state of Michigan, actually, believe it or not, was actually one of the most dominant players in solar panel production. They at that time, they were around 45%, worldwide production was coming out of factories in Michigan, believe it or not. So again, the United States was well positioned, but China was able to produce a better quality product at a better price point and really be able to dominate that market. Now we're shifting to a point where, these cells that are used in these solar panels, about 98% are made in China now. And so again, when we're looking at solar power, tremendous amount of solar power is being used, throughout China. We're looking at wind turbines. We're looking at hydroelectric dams. There's a really fun fact. China just started construction on the world's biggest hydro dam that's going to be in the mountains of Tibet. Upon completion, that one project alone in Tibet will generate as much power as the entire United Kingdom annually. So
really?
You just think,
wow.
Yeah. So you think about like,
they're freaking out right now. Right. They're freaking out right now with energy as we speak because of the Strait of Hormuz. They had to, subsidize energy prices. The government's going to be subsidizing it. But Keir Starmer did like a whole press conference a month ago on this. But sorry, continue on. Sorry.
No. So I mean, it's just interesting because, obviously, you look at the amount of electricity that China's already producing. Well, by the time that this dam gets completed, you're now going to add in an entire United Kingdom's worth of electricity, to the existing grid. And that's where China is really positioning itself for the future. And again, I think when you're looking at the AI race, United States, we have to do something about this electrical grid. I don't know where everybody's at and where everybody's, with their power bills, but our electricity bills are going higher every single year compared to, what we used to pay 5-10 years ago. And it's going to continue to increase because there's just more demand, right? We have more people here. We have more electricity demand. You look at like these massive, Googles and Metas, who are building data centers. I mean, it's a huge, stretch, strain, I should say, on these electrical grids. And, that's going to be a major story over, in the United States over the next 10 to 15 years. And I mean, again, China is, certainly impacted by the Strait of Hormuz. But that being said, they're very good in diversifying, so actually, a lot of people think, oh, okay, China buys 90% of Iran's oil. Yeah, they buy 90% of Iran's oil, but Iran's oil only makes up around 10% of their oil imports. So yeah, they're Iran's number one customer, but it's not like they depend on Iran for that oil. They have great relations with many other countries, and you buy oil from the United States, for example. Small portion.
Who's the biggest? Who do they buy the most oil from for China?
Russia.
Russia by far. Okay. What? How much?
22%. 22%. Somewhere there. 22 to 25.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. You were saying more about the renewable energy.
Yeah. So I mean, you're going back to that story I mentioned earlier when it was electric cars. On the road. I mean, this was a big story of why pollution actually was being able to be reduced. Again, back in 2007 when I first arrived in China, every single car on the road, it's a gas powered car. But now in China, 60% of the cars on the road are electric vehicles. They dominate that market, and that's a big part of the story of why pollution has decreased. Why there's so much trust in this EV sector. I mean, if you've never ridden in a Chinese EV, there are some of the most incredible cars. I mean,
there's a reason why they don't sell them here. I was going to say there's a reason why they don't sell those electric vehicles here. And was something like 30 to 40% of their vehicles now are electric, if I'm not mistaken? 60%.
60% of the cars on the road in China right now are EVs. You go to major cities like Shenzhen, which is in the south. Shenzhen is like the Silicon Valley of China. Their entire bus fleet in this mega city of 25 million people, every bus in that city is electric. Right? There's not a single gas powered bus in the city. All of it's electric. If our guests here are interested in seeing the Chinese EVs, great guy on TikTok. His name is Forrest.
Someone in chat said they catch on fire a lot. They're hating. Guys, if you guys got questions on China, by the way, get them in right now. OSS guys, especially, get your questions in because obviously, so this is Cyrus's, wheelhouse. So if you guys got questions on China, please go ahead and get them in now while you guys can. But sorry, go ahead. They were talking smack saying that the cars catch on fire a lot, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, we live in this social media world where we see a car catch on fire and it's like, oh man, all of the Chinese EVs are terrible. The quality's bad. I mean, how many cars in America catch on fire? It happens. It's not an anomaly. It's not like it's only happening in China. But it's a similar thing. I mean, we go back to this. Let's go back to COVID 2020. There was a video that went viral where in some local village, people, they were asking everybody to stay inside, and so what one of these local guys did is he literally welded the door shut so that the people would stay in there. So all of a sudden, I hear this comment all the time. Oh, China's a terrible country. During COVID, they welded everybody's door shut, and forced everybody to stay inside. Okay, you've seen one video. Do you think that this is how 1.4 billion people are living in China? You think everybody's door's been welded shut? And again, I'm not trying to say that was right. I mean, obviously it's a wrong decision to weld somebody's door, to keep them inside during the COVID lockdown. But there's also, some context there as well. This is not like it's not like a policy came out from Beijing. Hey, we must now weld all the doors shut and make sure that every single person in China stays indoors. Again, but you listen to some of these anti-China YouTubers, they'll totally, take this, and just blow it out of proportion and be like, this is why China is so evil. China's welding the door shut. Everyone's locked down. There's oppression. There's no freedom. And there's many cities in China that actually during the pandemic, they weren't really that affected by COVID. There was many cities. It was kind of a case by case study, and so many cities were actually open during there. If you went out to Western China, out in other some cities like that, I mean, living normal lives. I mean, I talked to many people over there that were like, yeah, COVID hasn't been too bad over here. Obviously bigger cities like Shanghai, pretty tough. They had a brutal lockdown in Shanghai. So again, it's very dependent on where you are. And I think the biggest thing I want people to understand is you have to have a lot of nuance, when you're looking at China, because the story that Western media is going to tell you, it's definitely not the truth. China's not perfect. I mean, it certainly has its problems. It's certainly, right now, let's be honest, the economy right now is not strong in China. The real estate market is correcting severely. A lot of correction there. Youth unemployment, significantly high right now, close to like 20% in China, which is a very, very tough metric for the younger generation. So it's not all peaches. It's not all roses and, rainbows over there in China. I mean, they've had their problems. They have their problems that they're continuing to deal with. But name me a country that doesn't have problems that we're not trying to solve and go through right now. You look at the rising cost of living here in the United States, it's astronomical. It's remarkable how much, prices have increased across the board, no matter where you are, in the United States, when you talk about daily living and, just compare that to 5 years ago, what the prices were.
So rare earth metals, this is something that's really important. Obviously, this is why Trump wanted to take Greenland, right? You look at I know one of the main ones that the U.S. government is really interested in was like dysprosium, which, for the viewers here, I know you know what it is, but obviously it's a magnet that allows you to still operate in very high temperatures. China manufactures or has 90% of the market share, if I'm not mistaken, on rare earth metals. Can you talk about that a little bit and why that's so important and why this actually has me very concerned, as an American, that strategically speaking, this can be a serious problem for us.
It is, and I want to kind of rewind it back a little bit because rare earth metals, they're not actually rare. That's just like that's basically just the name. So we tend to think of like, oh, these are rare, like we can't find them anywhere. That's not the actual meaning of the word. There's rare earths all over the world. There's tons of rare earths in Canada, in the United States, in Australia, China, Russia, Ukraine. I mean, they're all over the place. Greenland as well. But the issue is the processing, and this is kind of where that we need to really get a little technical and kind of understand this. So in the United States, when we look at these rare earth minerals, we can process them up to a 99.5% purity. That's the highest we get to do in the United States. We just don't have the capacity to get any closer than that. But interesting enough, China can go to 99.9% purity. Now that difference is 0.4% or 0.4, but it's everything when it comes to these minerals. So when you're looking at, for example, the semiconductors and these advanced things that we're using the rare earths for, the magnets, and there's so many different industries that this touches. You look at like titanium, for example, 40% of an F-35 fighter jet, 40% of that aircraft is titanium. You're looking at some of these minerals, for example, are being used to make the heat shields on the actual aircraft. So it's not the actual metal, but it's the material that's on top of the metal that actually makes it heat proof. Those are the critical elements that we're discussing. So again, only China can manufacture that to 99.9% purity. Now 99.5, 99.9 doesn't seem like a big difference. It means everything. Semiconductors, you can only use 99.9%. So you have to get it processed from China, and they've just built the systems. And this is really, when you go to China and you tour the factories, you see how things are built there. It's the ecosystem that is really, really big. And so again, it's not just about like, well, why don't we just build a factory in America and let's just start processing to 99.9? Problem solved. Well, it's not that easy to do because it's everything. It's the whole ecosystem and how to get to that level. And again, everything in China, in America, it takes a long time. It's a lot of bureaucracy here. A lot of red tape. A lot of stuff that is very difficult to get past. This is why, for example, when we look at the tariff war, and in the tariff war, in theory, it makes sense on paper, right? If we charge, for example, if you're wearing Nike shoes, and we don't want those manufactured in China anymore. So what we're going to do is we're going to put 100% tariff on it. That way that Nike is forced to now open a factory in the United States. Well, the issue with that is even if Nike's on board with that, how long is it going to take to build a factory in America, right? How long is it going to take to get your supply chains rerouted from China to the United States, right? I mean, this is like a 5 to 10 year plan. Because you think Nike has one factory? They've got hundreds of factories all over Southeast Asia. They're not only manufacturing in China, but Bangladesh, Vietnam, many, many different countries. But you think about the steps of how Nike has been doing that, right? Nike didn't go to China last year. They've been there for decades manufacturing. So you think of like the investments, the billions of dollars that Nike's been investing overseas, building these factories, building these supply chains, getting it to the point where they can get an affordable shoe made at a very cost-efficient price, to then import back into the United States. And obviously, as a publicly traded company, what is their goal? Their goal is to maximize shareholder value. So again, it's they want to manufacture overseas because they can increase their profit margins.
Yep.
I think Dave Chappelle had a really good segment there where he's just like, man, it's like we don't want to make Nikes. We want to wear them. Who the hell wants to work in an American factory making Nike shoes? I want to wear Nikes. I don't want to make them. And so again, but you're also looking at the policy. If you and I are Nike executives, Myron, and we're thinking, okay, Donald Trump wants to put these tariffs in. Are we just going to start okay, let's put in these plans. Okay, well, it's going to take a year to get the building plans done. In order to get, we're going to get an architect to design the factory. We got to go through the U.S. government to get it approved. Okay, great. Now we've broken ground. It's going to take another couple of years to build that. Now we're going to start rerouting. Again, this is multiple years in the making. So it's not like, I've talked to so many Americans who are like, oh, great, let's just start bringing manufacturing back to America. Like, we don't need China anymore. It takes forever. It takes forever to do that.
And it's funny because when Trump was first announcing these tariffs, like a bunch of these, guys from the top 500 Fortune 500 companies came in and were like, hey, look, are you serious about these tariffs? Or are you going to actually bring these, have a long-term infrastructure? Or are you just doing this for, trade purposes and have a trade war? He didn't want to he didn't want to answer their questions. So we know what it's for. It was more about, to hardline on negotiations versus actually bringing trade back, which is tariffs in theory, if you actually see it all the way through, can work, but it's a long-term process because like you said, yes, you have to bring all that infrastructure back over to actually manufacture the products here.
It is. And I think, there's a really interesting speech by J.D. Vance last year when he said, globalization has failed. It's failed. It's been a failed experiment because, and this was his words verbatim. He said, because China and these other countries like Vietnam, they were supposed to remain, at the bottom. Like basically, we don't mind them manufacturing our stuff. That's cool. Like you guys can have a factory, you can make our stuff, but you guys are below us, right? America's number one. You've got to be below us. But what happened is that China was very good at manufacturing. If you go back 20 years ago, China didn't innovate. China copied, right?
Yep.
China was definitely they were a copycat nation, right? And so what happened is like, if you had these great pairs of Nikes, they're like, okay, let's break down these Nikes. How did these Americans make these Nikes? How did they do it? We're going to make our own version. We're going to make a fake version of it. We're able to copy your technology very good. And that was the same, whether it was, electronics or this or that. But then what happened is that China started innovating. So you start saying is they said, well, we don't want to just be the world's manufacturer. We now want to be also the inventor and also the supplier. And we want you guys to buy from us. We want to buy from Chinese companies. So that's what happened. This is like when we're looking at the electric vehicle market, the EVs blow anything Tesla has out of the water. I mean, they're just so much more advanced, so much more, well engineered. I mean, it's honestly fascinating when you go and drive these cars in person for the first time, in China, or you take a DD. DD would be like your local taxi. So if you take a DD, I mean, you're going to get an EV car, and they have different levels. So you can get like the super high end level, where the guy shows up in white gloves. It's like a professional chauffeur, driving you around the city, and it's like, I mean, you're talking like $100,000 car, and it's like, wow, this is nice. I mean, you want to talk about luxury, that's the $100,000 Chinese EV. That's that's like a Rolls Royce level. I mean, it's super high end luxury. And so again, they're
they
like
got cheap ones too, right? That are very affordable, if I'm not mistaken. I think I saw one of your videos that there's one they got EVs for as low as like 10,000 US.
100%. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So like the BYD Seal, I believe it is. I think that's like their lowest price point is, about $10,000. You can get a, very functional, high performing car that runs great. And so, that's, I made a video where I went to Azerbaijan last year, and I actually was, that was my first time being able to test drive a BYD because I can't get it in the United States. It's illegal. But interesting enough, Myron, when I was at the Consumer Electronics Show, which is the biggest tech show in the world every year in Las Vegas, every first week of January, there was no presence of Ford, GM, none of the American was there. But what they did is all of the Chinese manufacturers drove their cars up from Mexico with Mexican plates across the border and drove them to Las Vegas. And that was the talk of the town. Everybody wanted to see the Chinese EVs.
Oh,
and
wow.
so, yeah, you had a huge void there, right? I mean, again, this is.
And they let them in. The customs let them in.
They let them in for
just
for
that show. Okay, for the show.
Yeah, they let them in for that show. Maybe they stayed there. I don't know. I mean, maybe somebody got it in. I mean, interesting enough. I mean, I think there's you can import a car from China into the United States. You're just going to get 100% tariff on it.
Yeah.
So you're going to get and you have to go through the logistics of shipping that and all that. Interesting enough, you can look this up. Jim Farley, who is the CEO of Ford, he went to Shanghai. He was so impressed with the SUVs there that's literally what he did. He put a SUV on an airplane, flew it to Detroit, and there's multiple reports. You can Google this where he just said, "Look, man, I'm driving my Chinese SUV along the streets of Detroit. I don't want to give it up, man. It's like that thing is awesome. Like I absolutely love that Chinese EV." So it's kind of like, dude, you're the CEO of Ford, and you're driving a Chinese EV in Detroit. I mean, like I can't give you a better testimony of like the quality of Chinese EVs than if you've got the CEO of Ford going through that hassle of paying all the import tax. I don't know how much it costs to ship a car on an airplane from China to Detroit. It ain't cheap though. So, I mean, but that's what he did, because he's like, I want to have this car in America. I want to have it here. And, maybe he's studying it. Maybe he's saying, well, hey, I'm going to get my engineers to, reverse engineer this. Now we're going to be the opposite. Now let's us try to see what kind of, technology is going there. You look at battery technology, CATL, that's the number one battery manufacturer in the world. They've now developed a new battery with BYD where you can actually charge your electric EV like you do at a gas pump, where you literally plug it in and within 3 minutes, it's gone from 20% to about 80%. Not a full charge, but man, 3 minutes, you can charge it from 20 to 80. I mean, that's not much longer than it takes you to fill up your tank of gas.
Yeah.
But that's what's happening in China right now. So again, that technology doesn't exist in America. That technology is not American engineering. That's again, Chinese engineers that have developed that technology. You look at drones. I mean, look at how advanced the DJI drones are. DJI, massive company out of Shenzhen, the Silicon Valley of China. Again, just really really incredible stuff that we're seeing out of China that, again, I mean, you need to go there. You need to experience it. You need to see it for yourself. And I think that's kind of when you mentioned speed, I show speed when he went to China, he did a really good job of just really live streaming. I mean, he didn't have an agenda. He, so many, he would stream for 6-7 hours, go on the metro system, go here, go there, do this, do that.
And this is Asia in general, like Japan has this, South Korea has this, like it's just cleaner and safer than America significantly, right? Like this isn't just a China thing, like Asia in general for a lot of these countries, like, it's safer, cleaner, no better public transportation.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the safety is a big thing. I mean, I think that's, for me as an American that was living over in China for a long time, that's one thing that I just always absolutely loved about my life there. You could wear an expensive watch out, you can have jewelry on, you could have, a pocket full of cash, you could go out in a city of 25 million people at 2 a.m. and no one's going to bother you. You're never going to be feared of being mugged or, a gun pulled on you, because guns don't exist there. Right? They don't like that. And I know that that's like a big sticking point, right? Like, and this is kind of, this is maybe a really important message we can share with our viewers here, is that if you try to understand China from an American lens, it will not make sense to you. Yeah. Vice versa. If a Chinese tries to understand America, it doesn't make sense because our cultures are different, right? Like, I'm an American. I was born and raised in Florida. I, for example, I know the Second Amendment in the United States is a huge deal for Americans, right? We want the right to bear arms. You ask Americans why? Well, number one, personal safety. I want to have a gun in my house just in case an intruder comes in. Number two, we believe that it keeps our government in check, right? They know that, U.S. citizens are armed. And, if there's a need to revolt against the government, we have that power to do so. That's an American perspective. But, Chinese are very pragmatic. They're just kind of like, well, if everybody has guns, you're just going to have a more dangerous society. Yeah. And we can look at that. Look at how many school shootings you have. Look at how many homicides you have. Look how many senseless gun violence you have in your city, in your cities. We don't envy that. We don't envy that freedom in China. That to us is chaos. We don't like that. And if you actually go back to and look at like Chinese history, for example, China, you always hear this from Chinese people. We have 5,000 years of history. That's a very, proud thing that many Chinese people say. Like, we're one of the longest living civilizations in the world. But if you actually look at that history, it's just been 5,000 years of chaos, right? Because this dynasty rises up and then the next dynasty comes in and slaughters everybody, destroys everything, burns everything down, starts new. So you kind of have this constant cycle of rising, falling, all the way up until the early 1900s, where, China's one of the poorest countries in the world. Like in the 1940s, China legit is one of the top 10 poorest countries on the planet. And so, but yet it has, 4,500 years of history, but yet it's, after all that history, all of the great dynasties, all the great emperors, it has nothing. And so that's where there's a lot of admiration, from Chinese people, because, whether you like Mao or not, one thing that Mao did is that he established the government that exists today. He established the Communist Party in 1949. Since then, it's been a relatively stable period of peace. Now, Mao's made some big mistakes. Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, there were decisions that led to famine. It was not like he was a perfect leader. He certainly made mistakes.
A lot of people died. A lot of people died. But, China, then, really, the godfather of the modern China would be Deng Xiaoping, who came to power in the 1980s. What was the first thing he did? He put on a cowboy hat and he came to the United States of America, went on a tour, and he's like, hey, we need to do business with you guys. You guys should be manufacturing over here. We want to trade with you guys. And that's really what's really started, China, this huge revolution that they saw, and you're looking at poverty alleviation. You're looking at the transformation that China's been. I mean, my father-in-law, for example, grew up in Guangzhou. He was one of 8 children. He tells me the story. I mean, he's like, Cyrus, I had no shoes growing up. Like, we lived on the streets, like we had nothing, like I didn't taste meat till I was about 13 years old because we didn't afford it. You didn't have meat. I mean, you had to have money to have meat. Yeah. We basically ate whatever we could eat, whether it be a bowl of rice for one day. That's all we got. I like to tell this story because I'm very proud of him, because basically him and his brothers, this is how they got their start. They basically found this factory that was making pens. And so what happened is they had the ink and then the pen, and somehow the machine wasn't working. So they just threw all these things out. Yeah. Well, they're like, well, dude, if we take the ink, we put it in the pen and screw it on, we got a pen. So they just found, like, basically
basically like 5,000 broken pens, and they just fixed them all one by one, and they went on the street and started like selling them. And they're like, oh my gosh, like we just made some money. All right, now what's the next opportunity we can do? That's literally how like my father-in-law started his business in China. It was just like finding pens at the side of a dumpster. Yeah, and that's Chinese. Like that is Chinese people. They're very resourceful, very savvy, and they're looking for an opportunity. And that's that. And so for now, like we're in Guangzhou. We're going to go back next month. We go to Guangzhou. We'll see him, and we'll go for lunch together. And he's very there's a pride. He's like, man, look at my city now. Like it's like, man, we used to like bathe in the river. We used to run around the streets with no shoes. Like we were so poor, we couldn't afford anything. And it's like now I can go to a restaurant and order whatever I want. Because obviously we've got stability now. We've got a good job. We've made it to a point where we're not worrying about that kind of stuff anymore. And so there's a big pride, for a lot of Chinese people.
I want to get into and I appreciate you coming on, by the way, man, educating us on this. Before we get into that round war, I want to know a little bit about, because you talked about communism and everything else like that. How does the government operate in China? Obviously we know most of the main infrastructure is owned by the government, but if you could quickly kind of summarize the people here, how does the government work in China, and how do the people respond to that governance?
Yeah, that's a great question, Myron. I'm gonna rewind it back a little bit and just kind of say, I think most Americans look at China in a very similar way that they look at North Korea, right? They think that they think that China and North Korea are the same, right? You have one guy at the top who calls all the shots. It's this strict authoritarian regime.
Missiles get shot off.
Yeah, I mean, like there's no freedom, there's no happiness. I always hear this way, like Chinese people have no idea what's going on outside the world. Of course they do. They know everything that's going on around the world. The news channel broadcasts everything. And the thing is that's interesting is that yes, Xi Jinping is the president of China. He's at the top. But this is what a lot of people miss. Xi Jinping's father was a very high-ranking government official in China. He actually met with Chairman Mao back in the day. He was a high-ranking general in the army. Now, when Xi Jinping entered into the party, he entered in at the bottom. He could not use his father's status to get an elevated position. It's like, hey, son, you want to go into politics? Start at the bottom. You're literally starting at zero. It took him 37 years to go from the bottom, all the way to China's, official, top, to get to the president. Now, how did he do that? The way that it works in China is a system of meritocracy. And this is an interesting one, right? You look at, for example, if we look at, George W. Bush, and we look at his father being a president, and, obviously your father's a president, you're going to be able to get some leverage there. You're going to be able to get some help. Absolutely. He can certainly, I can certainly help my son get elected because I've got a tremendous amount of connections here. And we know this. I mean, we see this in American politics right now. There's a certain reason why during Trump's inauguration, why was Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and, the CEO of Google and all of these big tech guys that are worth trillions of dollars combined, their net worth, why are they all, with Donald Trump at the top? Because if you have money, you can influence the political system in America. Okay. And so that's what's interesting about America. There's a famous quote from an economist named Eric Lee. And he said, in China, you can't change the party, but you can change the policy. And in America, you can change the party, but you can't change the policy.
Yep.
And so that's a really famous quote from Eric Lee. He gives a fantastic TED Talk, by the way. Just put in Eric Lee, L-I. Eric Lee, put TED Talk. You'll be able to find his speech. It's quite old now. It's about probably 12 years old now, that speech. But it gives a good, that actually answers this question a lot better because he goes into exactly how the government is functioning. Fun fact please do. That there's an interesting one where, again, we tend to think of Xi Jinping at the top, but actually in China, there's local governments that are making decisions. And one thing I always say, this is very important for people to understand, China is incredibly diverse. It is very different than the United States. We look at the United States and China, if you look at the landmass, they're practically the same. They're almost about the same size geographically. But in China, there's 300 different languages spoken in China.
Oh,
right?
Really?
There's all,
I thought it would be like Cantonese, Fukienese, and Mandarin, but I didn't realize it was more than that.
Yeah, those are three. There's another 297 to go.
Holy crap.
Yeah, so like you go to Shanghai, for example, the locals speak Shanghainese. You go to Chongqing, they speak Chongqingese. You go to Suzhou, they speak a dialect in Suzhou. So everywhere you go, there's regional dialects. There's, obviously Mandarin is the number one language. That is the dialect of Beijing. And since Beijing was the capital, they said, okay, this is going to be the national language. If you go to Shanghai,
if you speak, I guess, Mandarin, will people in Shanghai understand you?
100%. Yeah, everyone will speak that. But so that's how you differentiate if you're local Shanghainese, right? If you're local, you're going going to speak Shanghainese, right?
Okay,
And
gotcha.
so for example, generally speaking, most of your taxi drivers in Shanghai are local Shanghainese. So if you're pulling up to a red light and let's say a guy doesn't know the directions, he might wave to the next taxi driver and then they'll just start speaking Shanghainese because he'll just assume, hey, this guy's a taxi driver. This guy's definitely Shanghainese, like me. So, and you start to see that. You start to see that where, like if you're trying to do a business deal in Shanghai, like you better have a local Shanghainese guy because like Shanghainese people want to deal with Shanghainese people. They don't want somebody coming in from Beijing and doing stuff down there. So it's a little bit, there's a lot of like nuances there. And again, it's about having these different connections. You go to Guangzhou, Guangzhou, Cantonese, rules. Cantonese is a very spoken language down there. Now, Mandarin's becoming more and more popular because people from other parts of the country are going in there. So yes, I mean, you learn to speak Mandarin, you will go anywhere in China and have no problems communicating. That being said, there's a lot of villages. For example, I got a chance to be a best man at a wedding. It was for my Chinese colleague, and he was from a very small village. Just in the mountainside. And so his father came. His father could not speak Mandarin. His father only could speak that local dialect because he'd really never left his village. And so I was kind of amazed because I speak Mandarin and I've studied it and I've lived there for 10 years. So I'm like, wow, this is kind of crazy. Like I have no way to communicate with this guy because he literally cannot speak the national language of China. He's a local villager. He literally only speaks his local dialect. So, as you can imagine, when you go to these local villages, how does it work? Well, they actually have a democratic system, where they're going to elect a leader of that village democratically. They'll vote. They'll you're going to be in charge of our village. You're going to be going forward. And so there's a lot of, nuances. There's a lot of like democratic processes that are existing within China. But generally speaking, obviously, like the government in Beijing oversees everything. But again, it's a much, much more complex system. So if anybody's interested in actually learning how that system works, just type in Eric Lee, Li, TED Speak, TED Talk.
I already wrote it down. I'm going to definitely watch it.
You'll be able to find that. And he gives a really, really good, kind of 20-minute analysis, kind of breaking down exactly how that system works. So again, it's actually very organized, very complex. And so it's just very different than what we hear. We just tend to think,
is it like, would you say it's like it's a pseudo communist / democracy type thing? Or if you had to like quickly give it a...
Well, the official, like it's communist by definition, right? It's called the Chinese, the Communist Party of China is the official government title. But actually Chinese would describe it as it's socialism with Chinese characteristics. So it's much more of a socialist society, where they're really wanting to make sure that everybody in China is able to have, like the rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah.
They want to make sure that they see all members of society be able to improve their lives and increase. And so, it's a very, but that being said, right, like if it was communist, are you allowed to invest in the stock market? Are you allowed to, flip real estate? Are you allowed to start your own business? Are you allowed to be able to make an unbelievable amount of money? There's a tremendous amount of billionaires in China. Why?
Yeah,
because they embrace capitalism and they, created these incredible companies.
Too.
Lots of millionaires, lots of billionaires. So again, if this was a real strict communist, style, there would be no millionaires. There would be no billionaires, right? Everybody would be equal. But it's kind of this hybrid model, I would say, where they've embraced the capitalistic roots. There's elements of democracy for sure. There's elements of socialism. There's elements of communism. So it's very much a hybrid system that is unique to China. There's no other government in the world that operates like that. And that's why China doesn't go around the world saying, hey, you guys should be like us. You should adapt our, government because why would you? Your country's not like China, and that's kind of a difference that I want to say, like, right, you're in America, doesn't matter. You can be in Florida, Washington, Hawaii, Alaska, Texas. We all speak English. It's more or less the same wherever you go in America, right? We're one country. China is a lot more diverse, a lot more unique in that perspective.
Mm-hmm. All right. Taiwan. Obviously, there's quite a bit of fear in the U.S. We talk about it all the time. Is China going to invade Taiwan? Obviously, especially with the Iran, conflict going on. We mobilized a lot of our assets out of the region to support in the Middle East. And, we're down on stockpiles, etc. What is the deal with Taiwan? Is there a real threat there? Is China going to invade, or what do you think is going to go on there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the interesting thing is that in theory, right, this would be the perfect time for China to attack, right? Because, the United States is spread very thin. We've now moved these THAAD missile radar systems out of Korea, moving them over to the Middle East. We see this. I mean, we've supported the Ukraine war for the past 4.5 years. That has depleted a lot of our stockpile. We've obviously supported in this new war against Iran that has depleted a tremendous amount of stockpiles. So, the theory is, and again, this is what you're hearing in Western media, is that there has never been a better time for China to attack Taiwan because they see the United States vulnerabilities. Even the fact that, the United States military, as grand as it is, it has not been able to open the Strait of Hormuz. Here we are, week 9 of the war. It's not back to what it was like in February 27th. There's been a tremendous disruption to the oil markets, to the global oil markets. But also you look at the strategic military objectives that we set out. We want a regime change. That hasn't happened. We want to get rid of the uranium in Iran. That hasn't happened. We want to deplete their missiles. That hasn't happened. So there hasn't really been a military win for the United States yet in Iran 9 weeks into this conflict. We thought it was going to be a pushover. So, again, that kind of feeds to the theory. Hey, China's looking at America like, hey, you guys can't really take down Iran. Maybe you have no chance against us. But here's the nuance that you need to understand. So around the world, okay, about 182 countries in the world recognize the one China policy. Now, the one China policy is meaning that Taiwan is part of China. Now, if you were to go to the White House today and you were to ask President Trump spot blank, do you believe that Taiwan is part of China? The answer that he will guarantee give you is absolutely I do. I believe in the one China policy. Because in order for a country to have diplomatic relations with China, you must adhere to the one China policy. So there's about 12 nations in the world that don't, right? 12 nations in the world recognize Taiwan as an independent country. Those 12 nations are very small. Like there are islands in the Caribbean and, like islands in the Asia Pacific region, like very, very small countries. Basically, no major country in the world recognizes this. And so what you have right here is you already have the majority of the world, including the United States, already admitting that Taiwan is part of China. Now, Taiwan operates in a gray area, right? Because they operate as an independent country, right? They have their own passports, they have their own government, they have their own currency. They're united by the same language. In Taiwan, they do speak Mandarin as well. Very similar culture, obviously, as Chinese. But the interesting thing is that we have this thing called strategic ambiguity. And what that simply means is that we recognize that Taiwan is part of China, but yet we also kind of treat Taiwan as more of an independent country. There's this gray area that has existed for the past 60 years, and that's basically how the US, China, and Taiwan all function. And so what you have is you basically have, the status quo, as we say. And this is what most Taiwanese people, would support, where it's like, do you want to support independence? Actually, majority of Taiwanese don't support independence. They also don't support unification with China. What the majority of Taiwanese support is the status quo, which basically means keep everything the same. Like we're doing good. We're doing our own thing over here in Taiwan. China's not invading us. We're good. Like we're Taiwan's doing our thing. Mainland's doing their thing. We're operating in this gray area. But the thing I want people to understand is I don't think that this is a threat at all, because for Chinese people, they look at Taiwan as their brothers and sisters, right? These are Chinese people at the end of the day, speaking the same language. There's many families that are, have family members on both sides of the strait. So again, like what would Beijing accomplish by all of a sudden launching a war against Taiwan? What are they going to do? They're going to bomb Taipei. They're going to, start bombing all the infrastructure. They're going to start killing civilians. They're going to start bombing the semiconductor factories. What win does that get China? It gives them nothing, right? Yeah. It gives them absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
Taiwan is absolutely crucial to the world economy. We look at, for example, the semiconductors. 90% of the most advanced semiconductors in the world are coming from Taiwan. You bomb that and you take out TSMC, the whole world's screwed. Yeah. Right. So China doesn't benefit from that. When you're looking at an analysis of this, what does China actually have to gain from actually invading Taiwan? They gain nothing. They lose everything. So you're looking at the cost equation. It's a total loss for them. It makes absolutely no sense. Now I would be lying if I would say like certainly the goal for China to reunify with Taiwan at some point. Yeah. They definitely would like to see a peaceful reunification. And kind of the X factor here, Myron, that a lot of people need to understand is I always say this: the ball is in the United States court. Let's just say that Trump wakes up one day and he says, you know what? I've had enough of this. I am going to declare Taiwan an independent country. The United States government will now officially recognize Taiwan as an independent country. Now that would be the start of a very big conflict, because all of a sudden China would say, wait a second, for the last 60 years, you've been adhering to the one China policy. Yep. And now you're saying that this territory is not ours. We will go to fight over that. So let's just say that Donald Trump starts moving in naval ships and he says, you know what, in preparation for a China attack, we are going to militarily defend you. And we're going to put in all our battleships there. We're going to station U.S. troops on the ground. We're going to go all in on this. China would be ready for a fight. They would definitely go to war for that. But again, the catalyst to that was the United States would have to start that. Yeah. China's not going going to start that. But again, China doesn't want a war with America. China, again, can you imagine a
It'd be
war
bad
between
for
the United
both
States
parties.
and China?
It'd be bad for both parties. Very bad for both.
It'd be bad for both parties, but it'd also be bad for the world economy. There
Yeah.
you go. World economy crashing,
Yeah.
right? China, economy crashed. So again, look at China's success over the last 40 years, right? Like I said, back, 50, 60 years ago, China, one of the top 10 poorest countries in the world. Now it's risen to a superpower. So what, you're going to sacrifice that 60 years of progress to what? Go start a war? It just doesn't make sense. So I think that's
pragmatic. And they don't start wars.
They don't start wars. It's not pragmatic. And that's, at the end of the day, I think is really important, Myron, for people to understand. And, you hear me say this word often during the stream, nuance. And this is the nuance that many people don't understand. I was playing with some, I was playing golf this week with some business members, here in Las Vegas. And that was their question. What about Taiwan? I think China's going to launch any second. Like any day, they're just going to start nuking them. I'm like, nuking them? Like, why the hell would they nuke them, dude? But no. Okay, maybe not nukes. They're going to just start launching missiles.
Well, that's the U.S. propaganda for you. That's the U.S. That's the U.S. news propaganda for you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where they're making it like that.
So I kind of explained things exactly like I just did to you, and they're like, "Wow, I never really understood that, Cyrus. Like I didn't get that." And I'm like, "Yeah, you go to Taiwan right now, dude. It's a great place. I've been to Taiwan many times. It's a fantastic place. Great culture there, great people. Best food. Arguably some of the best food in Asia. But I mean, it's everyone's living a normal life. People aren't worried about this. People are not going out like, oh my God, is this the day that China's going to attack us? I don't know. That is not crossing Taiwanese people's mind. Interesting enough, you did see the opposition party leader. You have two big parties in Taiwan. So the
one of the leaders is pro. One of the parties is like pro China. So it's like
So you got the KMT. KMT is pro China. So they actually just flew to Beijing and met with Xi Jinping, which is actually a very big deal. For a Taiwanese leader, to go there. But they had discussions and basically talking about the Strait. And here's a fun fact for many people that maybe probably don't know this, that Xi Jinping, when he was making his ascension to the top, he was the provincial leader of Fujian province. Now, Fujian is the province that's right across the strait from Taiwan.
Oh,
and so he lived there. Yeah, so he lived there for 18 years. So 18 years he was in charge of that province. So you can imagine Xi Jinping would have definitely learned the local dialect there, which is, Fujianese, which is, basically similar to Taiwanese. So, Xi Jinping would speak fluent Taiwanese, guarantee he speaks it. And what did he do? His whole thing was, well, let's increase trade, let's do more business, let's improve relations, and all of these steps. So again, there was no kind of animosity there, or like, hey, I'm in the province, just across the water from you. I want to build up our military resources here. I want to let's build up all this naval. Let's build a naval base here because this in the future, I could potentially use this. No, what did he do? He did more trade with Taiwan and improved relations. That's something that most people don't know about Xi Jinping. But he spent a significant amount of his career, in that province, specifically working with Taiwan.
I did not know that. Okay, so last thing here, and then we'll close on. I appreciate you coming on, man. This is great.
Sure.
I have a couple questions here, but I'll make them quick.
Sure.
Iran. I've been talking with my audience about this. I think we are losing this war strategically. I think there's been, Trump clearly underestimated the Iranians. He underestimated how much China would go to bat and support them, as well as the Russians. We know Aragachi, the foreign minister, met with Putin a day ago or so. I want to talk more about China's involvement in this conflict, how they're faring from this conflict, and your overall thoughts on it.
Yeah, fantastic. I think when we talk about like Iran, China has trade relations with the vast majority of countries around the world. About 125 countries China is the top trading partner to about 125 countries. So China trades. And, there was a big thing in the American media like, hey, China was making a shipment to Iran. There was like, Chinese supplies were going to Iran. This is illegal. This shouldn't be happening.
The rocket fuel, they were crying about that.
Yeah, but it's like, well, at the end of the day, you have two sovereign nations that are conducting trade with each other, right? I mean, as an American, we can just say, I don't like that, but it doesn't mean that we have jurisdiction. We have no business telling China that they can't buy uranium from Russia or oil from Russia. They're going to buy that. Same thing with India, right? We look at India. They have been the biggest purchasers of Russian oil over the last 4.5 years. And, Donald Trump is, meets with Modi and he says, with Modi, and he says, hey, Modi, I don't like you buying Russian oil. And he said, hey, man, guess what? We're the fastest growing economy right now. I need oil for my country. You know what? Like, I'm cool with you guys. Like, I want to still be friends with the U.S. That's cool. But guess what? Like, I'm also friends with Putin because
India plays both sides.
India plays both sides better than anybody.
Yeah.
And they have a very strategic way to do that because they never want to align themselves in one camp specifically. They're always trying to have, they want to have one foot on both sides, be strapped in the middle on that fence. And again, it just comes down to economics. When Russia was going through that war, going through the war, they're discounting their oil. They're selling it cheap. So look how much oil India consumes. They're like, fantastic. We get a discount on Russian oil. We can power our economy. Huge win for us. Obviously, we're going to take that win. Now, here's the fun fact that that many people probably don't know. Even during all of these sanctions, that the United States has posed on Russia, 25% of our energy in the United States actually comes from nuclear energy, and we need uranium to power that. Where do we get the uranium from? We get it from Russia. So this entire time that we've been fighting the Russians,
one of the few things that we still get from them. Yeah,
it's one of the few things. But again, like it's kind of a little bit of hypocrisy there, where it's like, hey, we need to sanction Russia. We can do no business with them. Oh, except this one thing.
Yep.
Like it's kind of a major thing. We're going to probably spend about $100 million a month on it. It's uranium. We need it, and we're going to make an exemption to that because, well, we can't supply our nuclear reactors for 25% of the households in America that run on nuclear, energy, and so that was the exception to the rule. So again, like I always kind of bring that up because it's like, well, are you sanctioning them or are you not? Like you can't half it, right? Like if you're going to do it, you got to go all in. You can't just keep making all these exceptions. And it was the same thing with the tariff policy, right? We saw Donald Trump say, we're going to tariff China. Oh, yeah, except electronics, because we kind of need those, all those keyboards and all those computers and all those phones.
Somebody asked here, how are tariffs affecting China, if at all? I was going to say probably not that much, huh?
Well, I mean, it's definitely, it's definitely affected China in some sense. It's definitely, made the margin smaller because, they're, a lot, you kind of have a lot of manufacturers that are struggling, because what happens is I have a friend of mine that owns a water bottle company, right? So he makes these water coolers, and his competitor would be Yeti, which is obviously a massive company, but he has a niche and he does quite well with his brand. But the issue is he makes them in China. Now he's a smaller brand, so he's like, well, I get squeezed, right? Because my prices are going up. So I'm trying to talk to my Chinese manufacturer, saying like, look, dude, I'm getting crushed with the tariffs. Can you give me a better price? So the Chinese they're trying to work with them, so they're going to reduce their margins a little bit. They're going to say, hey, we don't make a ton of money on these things, but we got to still make a profit at the factory at the end of the day too. But we're going to try to work with you. And then for him, he's like, I can't take that shock like Yeti, right? Like Yeti was like, all right, you know what? This is a temporary thing. We're going to just absorb the the cost of this, but because we're not going to just pass that massive cost on to the U.S. consumers. At the end of the day, someone's got to pay for the tariffs, right? But now you see now there's going to be a big tariff refund, and now you've got was it? Is it Lutnick's Sons? Lutnick's Sons were buying
a bunch of money.
Made millions
a bunch of money, dude. Yeah.
Right. So there's so much corruption going on, with all of these different things. I mean, you look at the oil trading. I mean, I know you've covered this before, the insider trading on the oil markets. All of a sudden, somebody just put a $250 million bet, shorting oil. And magically 10 minutes later, Donald Trump, sends out this tweet. Oh, I'm meeting with Iran. Everything's going to be great. And then the oil market crashes. Oh, wait, we just sold those options. Great. We just made, a couple $100 million off of that. Oh, geez, who was that? Oh, wow, it's the same trader that's doing this. He's like 5 for 5 now, making, just insane amounts of money. So, in regards to, China and what they're doing, they're going to continue having trade relations with Iran. They're going to continue to supply. They're not going to get involved militarily. You're not going to see, the military being involved in a deployment. I mean, they're never going to go to that extent. But it's just, I agree with your statement there, Myron, as far as the United States is losing this battle. I mentioned that earlier. 9 weeks in, we have not achieved anything of significance. The only thing that we can say is, hey, we've hit a lot of targets in Iran. Great. We've blown a bunch of we've hit a lot of buildings. Last time I checked, and this is what senior intelligence in America says, Iran still has about 50 to 60% of their missile capacity. They're not depleted. They got a lot of inventory left, and you can imagine they're building more right now.
They probably restocked too, during the break, exactly. And they make everything domestically pretty much. So it's like, they've achieved none of their strategic goals. The nuclear program is still there. Ballistic missile program is still there. Like their proxies are still getting funded. Hezbollah's, beating up the IDF right now in southern Lebanon. So it's like the reasons why we went to war are still in place, and now the Strait of Hormuz is closed too. So it's like we achieved nothing strategically at all.
We've achieved absolutely nothing. And John Mearsheimer, fantastic,
he's really
political
good.
Scientist. He just said this has been a masterclass in failure. It's just been there's been achieved. But of course, we live in this crazy world right now where Donald Trump is erecting gold statues of himself. Right now, that are just like now a new passport's come out. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
The new passport that Donald Trump, celebrating the 250-year anniversary.
Yeah.
Get your Patriot passport with my image and my signature all over it. I mean, I want to build this massive ballroom. I want to do all this stuff, to glorify
He was
me.
supposed to go meet with. He was supposed to go to China, but now he's not going to. I think the big reason why he's not going to go to China is because we're not doing too well in this war. So it's like he wants to go there with a W. I think he postponed it again, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. I mean, we're looking at it potentially. I think it was like before May 15th. I mean, there's some speculation. I mean, obviously China is ready for that meeting. I mean, I do think it's great when, the presidents of the United States and China meet. I don't know when the last time a U.S. president was on the ground in Beijing. I know that Xi Jinping was in China, or it was in San Francisco last year,
Yep.
for a visit. But I think anytime the two leaders of the two most important countries in the world are meeting, I think it's a good thing. And, I just think that it's really important for more dialogue between the United States and China. We'll see. I mean, if he's waiting for a win, then it sounds like his China trip's not going to happen for a long time.
Yeah. I got a few questions there. We'll make them quick, and I'll get you out of here, man. I appreciate you coming on again. Someone said, is it true that they're putting Muslims into camps? What's the deal with Muslims and Islam in China? I think he's talking about the Uyghurs. Is that how it's pronounced? If I'm not mistaken.
It's pronounced the Uyghurs, and so the Xinjiang is a very controversial, province, and it's actually an autonomous region in China. The key thing here is, we often hear this in Western media. There's a genocide going on in China. There's a genocide happening. I don't know of a genocide in world history that has seen a tremendous amount of population increase, right? So you look at the population figures in Xinjiang. Fun fact, Xinjiang is the #1 tourist destination domestically in all of China. It actually has the one region in China with the most amount of airports. There's 27 airports in Xinjiang, in the Xinjiang region.
Wow.
So you have a tremendous amount of infrastructure being built there. It has become super popular for domestic tourism there. So again, like, how do you have a genocide going on when the population is thriving? Again, they say, oh, okay, well, it's not a real genocide by definition. It's a cultural genocide. They're trying to erase their heritage. They're trying to make sure that they don't speak the Uyghur language, that these people don't go to the mosque. You go there, there's mosques everywhere. The local language is everywhere. And, and this is kind of a big thing that's been trending the last 2 weeks. China came out with a new policy, basically mandating that Mandarin is spoken all over the country. And it's very important for regions like Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia. Because again, like I said, remember the guy that the best man at my wedding, or I was the best man at his wedding.
Yes.
His father, he could not speak Mandarin.
Yeah.
Well, if you're a child born in Xinjiang and you could only speak the Uyghur language, you're limited. Where else are you going to go in the world? You can only stay in your province, right?
Yeah.
Or your autonomous region. You can't go to Beijing, right? You're a Chinese citizen that can't go to the capital and get a job because you can't speak the national language. So actually, when you go to Xinjiang and you go to Tibet, it's a good thing for these people to learn Mandarin. Now, China's not saying that you're not allowed to speak your local language. It's just saying, like, in school, right? Like in school, you're going to be learning Mandarin, right? And actually, there's another really good geopolitical commentator, Arnaud Bertrand, Frenchman. He's very big on X, fantastic follow for Geopolitics. He actually told a really interesting story because he said, I'm from France, and that's actually what we did, right? In France, we actually forbade all of these local languages in France and basically said everybody must speak the Parisian language. We actually got to the point where if you were speaking your local French language, we would make you wear like a sign and shame you. We'd make you walk down the street and actually shame you in the village. It's like, oh, you're like, you are not one of us. And it's like, none of that's happening in China, right? Like I mentioned, there's 300 languages. You go all over China, there's so many different dialects and things being spoken. But again, you have to have a national language that unifies the people. It's something that every country has. Every country has a national language. Well, I guess not every country, because the United States, we don't have an official one.
Someone here, I said, American are the Chinese, the feminine, docile, and submissive.
It depends on where you go. Shanghainese are considered very tough. In the Shanghainese household, the man always cooks and cleans.
No
and
way.
The Shanghainese women are Shanghainese.
So where's go for like the submissive women then?
I can't give you a region for submissive. I mean, everybody's a little bit different, but Chinese are, I think anywhere in the world you're gonna be able to find beautiful women that are, make great partners, and China's no exception to that. There are many beautiful there, and many kind that make great wives. I've married a Chinese as well, and she's fantastic.
What's China's relationship like with it?
Great question. China has a relationship with it. They
recognize them, right?
They definitely recognize them, but they definitely do not support the situation in Gaza. There was a really good clip of a Chinese diplomat meeting with an Israeli diplomat, and the Chinese diplomat called him right out. He said, "What you're doing is you're killing children in Gaza. This is a genocide." Of course, the they came back and said, no, we're like the most,
Self-defense.
Self-defense.
Moral
We're the
army.
most like,
Moral
we're the
army.
most, yeah, we're the most moral army in the world. We only target terrorists. He's like, no, that's nonsense. You target children. So they're definitely not on board with that. They definitely support Palestine as well, for sure.
Yeah.
They're 100% about.
I saw on WeChat, someone was telling me on WeChat, it's overwhelmingly like pro-Palestine, and they
100%.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah. I mean, because the thing is you have to realize is that, the Chinese they know the United States history around the world and the conflicts that we've started, the amount of regime change operations. This is why, I mean, for example, if anybody were to attack China in the sense of like, hey, we should, I hope the Communist Party fails and we can bring American democracy to China, that 99.99% of Chinese would say absolutely no, get the hell out of my country.
They saw Iraq, they saw everything. Then they see Iran now.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, when have we launched an air campaign and that has resulted in an actual regime change that's been successful? When have we actually won a war? When's the last time the United States actually went to war and actually came across victorious? I mean, Vietnam, in every stretch of the imagination, was a strategic failure for the United States military. I remember meeting with a former Marine who served in Vietnam, and he said, I went to Saigon. It's called Saigon. It's not called Ho Chi Minh. We won that war. I'm like, actually, it's called Ho Chi Minh City. And if you didn't know, it's still a Communist Party in Vietnam. We didn't win the war, dude. You can pretend all you want, but you're living in denial. And it's just call a spade, right? Just say what it is. We got our butts kicked there, and we didn't achieve anything after 18 years, and we left. Yeah. Exactly like we did in Afghanistan.
60K gone.
Yep.
But no, Cyrus, thank you so much for coming on, man. Where can the people find you?
Yeah, so you can follow me on X. It's just Cyrus Jansen if you just type that in, and also you can find me on YouTube, Cyrus Jansen as well. So just my name. I just keep it simple. But Myron, it's been a pleasure. I know we've been chatting for like weeks trying to get this lined up.
No, I'm glad that we did it, man. And like I said before, I wanted to kind of just show the other perspective with China, because it's something that honestly a lot of Americans like never get exposed to, never get to see. And I do think that we have quite a bit of anti-China propaganda out there. And I think that our government is lying to us a bit when it comes to China and their power and how quickly they're catching up to us. And I want to bring people up to speed and let them realize, like, hey, man, we don't live in a unipolar world anymore. It's multipolar.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And if you're interested in following China, I'm going back in about 3 weeks' time. I'll be there for the summer.
Sweet.
We're going to be recording a lot of videos on the ground in China. Kind of showcasing exactly what more people want to see. Right? They want to see the street vlogs. They want to see tours of the factories. They want to see all of these sites from the cities, and kind of speaking with locals. We're trying to really showcase like what the hell's going on in China in 2026. Well, follow the YouTube channel. We're going to bring you there.
Absolutely, man. Thank you so much for coming on, man. And guys, go check them out. I watch the channel all the time. It's great stuff, especially if you guys want to kind of get the truth on China. And I do think that a lot of places get it wrong where they put out a little bit of propaganda. So go check them out, guys. Cyrus Jansen. Thank you, dude, for coming on.
Appreciate you, brother. Take care.
Thank you.